So this presentation by Linda Wigington and Don Fugler will be addressing carbon monoxide.
Okay, so there's lots of potential sources of carbon monoxide in the house, and they all basically deal with combustion, with something being burnt. So if you have gas or oil-fired space and water heaters, if you have a gas dryer or a gas cook stove, if you have a wood stove or a fireplace in the house, all these things are burning something, and in the burning, they can create carbon monoxide. They don't always, but they can. You can also get carbon monoxide from especially heavy smoking inside a house. And if carbon monoxide is created in garages through starting up a vehicle in the garage or running a barbecue in the garage, for instance, then that carbon monoxide can affect people in the garage, but it can also move into the house and affect the concentrations of carbon monoxide inside the house. So these are some exposure guidelines. They're from various sources, including Health Canada, the World Health Organization, and OSHA, and the US EPA. So for carbon monoxide, the lowest end that people see symptoms at or give a warning about is 6 parts per million, which is very low. And that's a WHO 24-hour limit. And it can go up to, well, they say the high end is 9, but Health Canada, for instance, says 10. So in the order of 9 or 10 is what people say you should be exposed to over 24 hours, or you should avoid exposure higher than that over 24 hours. There are exposure limits from Health Canada for 1 hour, such as 25 parts per million, which means you can be exposed to carbon monoxide slightly higher if the duration is shorter. So in all carbon monoxide exposures, there's two things that have an effect. One is how much carbon monoxide is in your breathing zone, and two is how long that level sustains itself. So you can have a short high exposure, or you can have a long-term low exposure, and the results may be quite similar in terms of the health effects on your body. Okay, so there's a bunch of health effects, and as we pointed out, it depends on both the amount of carbon monoxide in the air you're breathing plus the duration of time that you're breathing that level. So I would say that a low-level exposure would be like less than 25 parts per million per an hour or less. And the symptoms then are quite limited. There have been measured reductions in exercise capacity in healthy people, but there are some more measurable effects on people who have existing conditions like coronary artery disease. And also, under 25 parts per million, if you live in a house and you're in, say, the 15 to 25 parts per million range for days at a time, that really hasn't been investigated too much, but there are clear signs that long-term exposure to these low-level carbon monoxide concentrations may be more significant than we have imagined. So medium exposure is something between 25 and 200 parts per million. And the sort of thing that you're going to see is headaches or dizziness or difficulty in breathing, some confusion. You know something's wrong, you're not quite sure what it is. And these sort of levels should be avoided. The high exposure is in the 200 to 400 part per million and above. And you can die from this. You may fall unconscious before dying, and you may suffer convulsions. So these are severe effects. These are concentrations that you should always avoid because the resulting health effects are severe.
So Don, how is it that CO causes, what does CO actually do to your body?
I'm not a medical person, but the body recognizes carbon monoxide as oxygen to a certain extent. And so the hemoglobin in the blood picks up carbon monoxide instead of picking up oxygen. So hemoglobin carries the oxygen around to the various parts of the body. And if it carries a lot of carbon monoxide instead of oxygen, then the parts of the body expecting oxygen are going to get something which doesn't work as well. So that's called your carboxyhemoglobin level. And most of the health recommendations are based on how high your carboxyhemoglobin level is due to exposure to carbon monoxide. The funny thing is that smokers who have exposure to carbon monoxide far higher than people who don't smoke, develop a high carboxyhemoglobin level to the extent that if someone saw that carboxyhemoglobin level in a normal person, they'd be worried about it because it would indicate some level of illness or disability. But in smokers, it's tolerated. And there is some question in the scientific community about how come smokers with already high carboxyhemoglobin levels are not particularly affected by more exposure to carbon monoxide.
I know that I mean, you think of those symptoms under the medium exposure, that's sort of typical flu symptoms, and or symptoms that are related to a lot of other things like COVID, or I mean, just a whole lot of different things can cause headaches, weaknesses, just feeling crappy mentally, physically, tired. And they'd go to an ER, and the ER would just say, "Oh, it's the flu, go home, sleep it off." And I mean, there were cases where people died because CO was not recognized when they went to a medical provider. I did not realize that the levels in the blood could really vary, and that could make it harder to diagnose. But in many cases, there's no screening or very little screening for possible CO exposure, and no questions asked. I mean, like, obviously, a key question would be, gee, do you feel better when you go outside? I mean, to some extent, that's a clear giveaway that something's going on in that house that's not good for you. Do you want to address what you've seen in terms of the exposure, like in the period I was talking about, which was more like the 20 to 35 years ago in carbon monoxide?
Well, there's a couple of factors in play. One, a lot of the combustion appliances back then were natural draft, which means they just vented into a chimney. They didn't have a fan to push the air outside. And natural draft appliances are far more susceptible to spillage or blockage or things like that, like a squirrel's nest in your chimney or crumbling chimney bricks or something like that can block up a chimney. And carbon monoxide being both without a smell and invisible, it's not the first thing you suspect when you start having these symptoms. The other thing, of course, is that in the several decades since Linda and I started working in this field, there have been home carbon monoxide monitors developed and sold and certified for that matter. So you have much better protection now than you ever had before. When we started, there were not carbon monoxide monitors or sensors available for most homeowners.
I'm going to briefly describe the CO monitor that we use within ROCIS. It's produced by CO experts. It is we consider it a low-level CO alarm because it actually will alarm. It'll go off at levels below 7, right? 7 parts per million in theory, or at 7. It's not sensitive until it sees 7 parts per million.
That's right.
Which is a whole lot better than the standard CO alarm you might buy at Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever, which don't go off until a much higher level. So our CO alarm can tell you that you've got a problem without it being bad enough that it could be killing you, which seems like a good thing. So a couple of things about this is it doesn't have any logging or downloading option, and you can view CO levels over time to sort of identify when there was an incident. In many cases, the CO presence might not be continuous, right? Particularly depending on what the source is. It might only be when you do certain things in the house or when it's a call for heat or a car's running in the garage. So in addition to lots of information on CO at CO experts, there's also information and other alarms, as well as this one being sold by TrueTechTools.com. And we basically said it should always read 0 all the time.
So, yeah, because it will not display, I think, until it gets to 7 ppm or higher. So you may have low values in the house, say, 5 or 6 or something like that, but it will be showing 0, which could be a little confusing to you if you know there is a CO source and it's still showing 0.
So operation, you just put the back plate in order to cause it to function, and then you test it, and it should give a shrill sound that is annoying and drives pets crazy. probably drives spouses crazy too. But we always say to test it. We wanted to talk in a little more detail about CO in the variety of places that can be the more common sources right now. And certainly gas stoves are the most common thing we've seen within the ROCIS initiative. And the frustrating thing is there's not a good way to get the CO level down necessarily with an existing cook stove, and even a new cook stove can still have elevated CO. There are adjustments and things that a person can do, but we have had cases where folks who are monitoring have called up a professional to check their gas stove, and they're basically told all gas stoves produce carbon monoxide. There's nothing you can do about it, or that's not bad, it's not on much. And that's really concerning. It is true that there might be cases where you can't eliminate the CO, but just making sure that the pressure is correct and that the surfaces are, particularly in the oven, you're not obstructing the airflow. Those are key things. Adjusting the flame can make a difference. So there are ways you can reduce it, but I would say carbon monoxide from gas stoves is probably the most political issue. So the key thing is it really makes sense to find out if when you're cooking you're getting carbon monoxide, and ironically the cooking process can actually produce carbon monoxide. So I've not tested this, but I've heard that cooking a turkey for 6 hours or whatever, 5 hours, can produce carbon monoxide that's not a function of a gas stove.
Huh?
Which could mean that there's something to the idea that everyone wanting to take a nap after a Thanksgiving dinner. But definitely how you use your burners. Anytime a burner impinges on a big container with cold water, I mean, that basically is going to cause incomplete combustion. So there are things you can do in just how you cook and being careful that would have some reduction. Or when you have the opportunity to cook outside, that could be a great option to minimize CO from cooking. Another thing is obviously there are a lot of other emissions from any stove, gas or electric, just the cooking process. So having a vented range hood is always good, and then using it is even more important. Having it won't do any good unless you use it. But if you don't have that, it's possible to just have a fan in a window and be pulling air from the kitchen so that if you're generating, whatever you are generating from cooking isn't spread throughout the house. We normally see in our data from particles that whatever you did in cooking that caused a spike is usually seen very quickly throughout the house. So it's important to recognize that what goes on in the kitchen doesn't stay in the kitchen. Any other comments on gas stoves?
Yeah, well, I was thinking when you were talking about long cooking hours for a turkey, anytime you create combustion, which means, some sort of charring or burning or toasting, you're probably creating the conditions to create carbon monoxide as well, because it is a combustion process at that point. So not only the gas flames, but it would be interesting, I guess, to test that turkey hypothesis in an electric oven with a sensitive carbon monoxide meter and see what is produced.
Right. One thing that I found out early on, because I did do inspections of homes that were done through utility programs, and I had a monoxer for that purpose, which is a far higher quality of an instrument than a CO alarm. And I mean, normally you would test what's coming right out the back in front of the sort of, what do you call that, a splash plate, the back of a stove. I mean, that's where whatever's in the oven is coming out. And it is typical when you first turn that on for the first less than a minute for the levels to be higher and then drop down. So that is much harder at startup to have a clean burn. But all of these are good reasons to not have gas stoves.
Or a good reason to have a very effective range hood, because even if you are producing carbon monoxide, if your range hood's picking it all up and sending it outside, you're avoiding exposure that way.
Right. Or if you have an induction cooktop, you could use that on a back deck. We've got at least one or two low-cost monitoring participants who have shifted cooking outside. And the nice thing about the induction two-burner stovetop is it's got a regular outlet, so you can plug it in any outlet. And if it's nice weather, it's very portable, very lightweight, so you could easily do some cooking outside rather than inside and avoid a lot of exposure.
but you may not avoid raccoons and squirrels.
True. So wood stoves and fireplaces can be sources, and this is an area that Don's done a lot of work on, the whole issue of air quality in wood stoves. So why don't you take this one?
Sure. The easiest thing to say is that with a properly installed and operated wood stove, you should not have any carbon monoxide or particles put into the house. I mean, basically, if the stove is drawing well and you are, for instance, you make sure that it's drawing well before you open the door to reload, then air goes into the stove and up the chimney rather than coming out into the house. So we have measured this, and in many houses with wood stoves, you don't notice any difference in the number of particles or the amount of carbon monoxide in it. Fireplaces are trickier because fireplaces are often hand-built and they have a much bigger opening and they often don't have a door. So fireplaces are a harder call. It's quite clear that you can get smoke spillage and potential CO exposure from fireplaces. And a lot of times people will not even notice it. For instance, in one of our tests, we had a homeowner who said, no, this fireplace works perfectly. And yet you could see the stained brickwork just above the fireplace opening, which had to come from smoke escaping and going up the mantle. In other cases, what you find is because of the type of the loading of the logs, or because of depressurization in the house, or because you didn't have the wood stove chimney burning hot again, that when you open the door to reload, the door opening in itself pulls a little bit of smoke into the house for several seconds, and you put the wood in, and then you close the door and it's all gone. So you get some incidental wood smoke, which will come with particles and may come with carbon monoxide as well, depending on where it is in the burn. The potentially high exposures of carbon monoxide from wood stoves and fireplaces are if your appliance is defective or poorly installed, or if there is some competition in pressures so that the chimney doesn't have all the air it needs and it starts spilling smoke into the house. One really common example of this is if you have an open fireplace without doors, and at the end of its burn, when there are just coals, the chimney's not getting a lot of heat to sustain its draft. And for instance, if you turn on a range hood at the same time, you may pull air down the chimney, reversing the chimney, causing a backdraft, and whatever's being produced by those coals will come into the house. At this point, you will not see a lot of visible smoke, but you can see a high amount of carbon monoxide. Well, you won't be able to see it because it's invisible, but you will get that sort of exposure. And it's the sort of thing that might happen in a scenario if you had you had a fire in an open fireplace in the evening, and then just before you go to bed, you turn on the dryer, and then you go to bed, and the fireplace backdrafts while you're asleep and creates a hazard due to the carbon monoxide in the house while you're sleeping. And that's when a good operating carbon monoxide alarm can save you.
So all the problems that Don's referring to in terms of pressure-induced backdrafting are more likely to occur in a tighter house, which would typically be a newer house, could just be a smaller house, than a leakier house. Though you can't assume that you've got good draft in any building regardless, but it's much easier to backdraft a fireplace chimney, or to cause, when you open a wood stove and you've got an exhaust source on, it's much easier for that exposure to occur if the house is very tight and there's already something going on that's competing for air. Basically, this is about competition for combustion air, and whether or not the chimney's going to get the air it needs, or whether or not it's going to come into the house and go out an exhaust appliance.
It's also true that not only would tighter houses be at risk, but any house with one of those incredibly high-powered range hoods, in the 500 to 1,000 CFM range. These are usually very expensive display hoods for designer kitchens or something, but rarely do they have an air supply connected with them. So it's almost like turning a blower door on. And if you have a fireplace or a wood stove operating, when this thing's sucking 1,000 CFM out of the house, there's a good chance you will see spillage from those combustion appliances.
Right. And actually, even 400 CFM can be pretty hazardous. Well, this third major source is actually one that has been around for a long time, and it's not just in garages, but garage is the source. There was actually, and it seemed like this mostly came to light when carbon monoxide alarms became more popular. And particularly in cold weather, cars would produce a lot more carbon monoxide when it was warmer. And people had repeated incidences where their CO alarm in their dining room would be going off, or the living space, and they had no idea why. But in really cold weather, people were more prone to turn on the car and let it idle to warm up. And that's also something that's no longer needed with current cars. But the whole idea of, oh, you should turn on a car and let it run for 5 or 10 minutes before you drive it was sort of an assumption years ago. But there was actually a pretty neat video produced in Minneapolis looking at a number of houses and documenting the effect of carbon monoxide from attached garages in the rest of the house, where they did good monitoring over a period of time and saw that the elevated CO could last 6 hours or even longer. But I know you did some work on this too, so why don't you dive in on this?
Well, the sequence was really interesting because in some of the test vehicles, even with the garage door open, you fire up the car when it has its dirtiest combustion. You drive it out, you close the garage door, and you could see up to, say, 400 parts per million of carbon monoxide in the garage. No one's there, so it's not really a problem. However, for the next several hours, the house in the winter is often drawing on air from the garage, and we've measured garage leakiness, and the house to garage leakiness is pretty well similar to the house to everywhere else. I mean, it's not tighter, it's not looser, it's about the same, though it would be a lot higher if you had ducting running through your garage, for instance. Anyhow, what they found out, say if you put 400 parts per million into the garage, well, it would take another 2 hours, for instance, to get above 35 ppm in the house, drawing on the garage, and that would set off the more sensitive carbon monoxide alarms. But you wouldn't affiliate it with a car starting 2 hours before. So there was lots of head scratching as to where that high level of carbon monoxide came from, without combustion appliances on. And it wasn't until we started measuring carbon monoxide in garages and measuring garage to house infiltration that we were able to establish that that was the case. And as Linda pointed out, advances in technology with vehicles mean that there's less CO produced and there's less need to warm up in the garage. So that problem is being minimized. Now, I have a 1966 Volkswagen and I started up and it can create a cloud of carbon monoxide that would probably kill everyone on the block. But luckily, I don't run it in the winter. And I don't have an attached garage.
Those are two advantages. So it's very common for a return duct work to go through, and it's like a tuck under garage.
Yeah.
So the riskiest situation is probably what you often see where the garage is under part of the house. But there still can be significant connections even if the garage is side by side next to either the first floor or next to the basement. But there's
very good information showing that benzene, which is another chemical VOC that comes from fuel, not the burning necessarily, it could be even raw fuel, but you do not have elevated benzene levels in houses with detached garages, but with attached garages and tuck under garages, you have much higher levels of benzene inside the house. So benzene is sort of a tracer gas for garage to house infiltration. And the data is quite clear that houses without an attached garage have lower levels of benzene.
Yeah, benzene's a carcinogen, isn't it? Not good stuff. And when you think about other things, I mean, people think of their garage as being outside of their house. So it's typically where a lot of things get stashed that people wouldn't feel comfortable having within their living space. And yet, because air moves and mixes, it's certainly a risk in addition to just the carbon monoxide. One thing, I recently bought a Prius, which I love, but I'm not sure how many times I've accidentally thought I had it off and then discovered when I was like outside and not that far from it and I heard it kick on that, oops, I had not turned it off. And it might have only been in the last 2 years, 8 times, 10 times. There's one time it was overnight, and I don't know how many times it kicked on overnight, but that is an increased problem with keyless ignition. It's obviously can be tricky with a car that's really quiet, and like the Prius, you assume it's off, and boy, unless you unless you make darn sure it could be running, and then as it kicks on, it doesn't run very long, but that would be the startup, so there could be more pollution at that point. So those are all sources that have only recently emerged.
It's funny, the cars, the emissions are getting cleaner, but your ability to control the emissions is getting more obscure.
Right. But you often hear of deaths that occur from carbon monoxide that are related to power outages, where, Texas had 20 or 30 deaths, it seemed like, maybe even more, when they had that severe power outage within the last year. And, that can be related to gas-powered generator, where somebody might think, oh, I'll just pull it in the garage and maybe leave the door open, or maybe not leave the door open. Or it just started raining, so they wheeled the barbecue inside the garage for shelter or whatever. So any of those combustion appliances can really wreak havoc. If you're in a power outage, the one case where I think a family of 5 had 2 people die and 2 others are severely disabled, but one person in the household head to the basement or the garage just to charge her phone, because she obviously couldn't charge it because the power was out, but she could start the car and charge it. And she never made it back in the house. So scary stuff. Really, yeah. It's just important to.
The other thing is that people in a power outage, especially an extended power outage, are worried about theft of their generators. So they might put them in the garage with the garage door closed to avoid someone walking off with their generator.
Yep. So it doesn't seem like, I don't recall with our data, it seems like there might have been one person that had a problem, and through behavior, they were trying to address it by making sure that they opened the door, backed the car out, and then put the garage door down right away. I don't know if you remember that case, but it seems like, and certainly when it's really cold weather, we always mention that the chance of carbon monoxide is more likely in really cold weather, but it doesn't seem like we've seen much in the way of carbon monoxide from garages. Does that meet your recollection?
Yeah, that's true. In fact, we have very few incidences of carbon monoxide from gas stoves compared to the size of our cohorts, the number of participants. And we've had no incidents of carbon monoxide from cigarette smoking because our participants rarely, if ever, smoke cigarettes. And that might be self-selection. But we have not been testing necessarily the most dangerous houses for carbon monoxide problems.
True. So if you were buying a CO alarm, what one would you get, Don, or what would you look for?
I like the low-level CO alarms, such as we're using in ROCIS. I know in the States they are not certified, and in Canada, the new CO standard, Canadian one, 6.19, has a special section for low-level, but no manufacturer, as of several months ago, had certified a product to it, curiously. So there's a lot of resistance from manufacturers to having low-level carbon monoxide sensors, and the one that we have doesn't meet the US or Canadian standards because it's too sensitive and displays results or alarms at levels that are not accepted by the standard. When carbon monoxide alarms came out, say 15, 20 years ago, they had problems with sensitivity. And not only that, they would drift, they'd go out of calibration. Plus, there was a lot more carbon monoxide in some cities than anyone had imagined. So they went off a lot. There was, I think, a case in Chicago where they had an inversion. So the outdoor carbon monoxide went up to 5 or 10 ppm. And then when you put the indoor sources on top of that 5 or 10 ppm, you were setting off carbon monoxide alarms over the city. And the advice at that time was to phone the fire department. And the fire departments responded and got upset because they couldn't find high levels of carbon monoxide in their estimation. So it was fire departments and the manufacturers who lobbied in the standards committees to get the alarm levels set at fairly high levels. So we talked about, 10 and 25 ppm, but in essence, you can have up to 65 parts per million carbon monoxide and your alarm may never go off. And that will be according to the standard. So they're deliberately made insensitive the beauty of the low-level alarms, like the ones we use, is that they can tell you that you have a carbon monoxide problem long before it becomes significant enough to cause health problems with anyone in your house. So as long as you're aware of these things and you respond to alarms or to elevated levels, like 10, 15 parts per million, and try and find out what the problem is, then you're avoiding the significant problems that come with the high levels of carbon monoxide in the house.
Yeah, the whole issue of that level, what the right level is. So, I mean, basically the bottom line is the standard CO alarms that you would buy in a store that are certified are designed to keep you from dying.
That's right.
But they're not designed to keep you from experiencing any symptoms. I think people vary in their sensitivity.
My brother was working in Japan as an English teacher, and the heater they had in Japan was an unvented gas heater, often underneath the table so you could keep your legs warm. And I said, when I was visiting him years ago, I said, so you ever run into problems? There weren't readily available carbon monoxide alarms at the time. And he says, no, he says, when I start getting a headache, I just open the windows. There probably would have been ways to tease out data on people with low-level prolonged carbon monoxide concentrations, but for the most part, those situations are not being created anymore.
Right. That equipment's not on the market.
Right.
Well, anything else you want to add to the CO discussion that you think we skipped over?
Well, and just to say historically, CMHC, when it first started doing spillage research in the 80s, commissioned a study looking at carbon monoxide deaths in Canada over 10 years, I think it was. And well over half of them were from cottage installations of propane-fired refrigerators.
Wow.
Because their combustion inside the house, they're often in places that are not well maintained. So you're not using the refrigerator on a regular basis, and spiders, clog up the air supplies and stuff like that. Or you don't know how it works. You just know that you turn it on. So it was curious that, that source of carbon monoxide and in that location was the cause of many of the carbon monoxide deaths seen in Canada.
Wow. Yeah, I can see how you don't think about it, but a propane refrigerator would be something that you would leave on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would think that there's the possibility of carbon monoxide exposure in RVs, because a lot of them don't have good ventilation and they often have propane-fired stoves, and they don't usually have a range hood. But I think most of them are now protected by carbon monoxide sensors, and I think that's really a good idea, because you have the same sort of cottagey environment, and it's often, a rental or something. You don't know how to work it. You haven't been maintaining it to any great degree, and you're in a fairly small space with combustion happening. So all those things could lead to carbon monoxide exposure.
Yep, for sure.